Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to finish out the styling for our global search and get as far as we can with our open menu state. Taking a look at where we left off last time, let's do a quick spot check to make sure we're happy with everything we have so far. On the right here in our live preview, let's just start tabbing through the elements we finished out last time and see if we like everything that we did. So we got our focus states and all these elements. Our skip nav link positioning is a little awkward at this breakpoint, so we probably want to address that. But all the hover states for the rest of the global header look good. So let's go ahead and address the skip nav link positioning if we tab back to that. So let's match the padding that we have on the global header at various breakpoints, and that way the skip nav link overlaps the brand. In our app.css, let's search for the skip nav, found it here. And if you recall in our last episode, we adjusted some of the responsive padding on our global header. So I believe we want these initial breakpoints for the mobile versus desktop layout to actually be around 1024, and then for the min width to be at 1025. We'll want to match the same thing over on our focus states. Give that a quick save. And if we tab over to it now, that's looking a lot better. Everything lines up a little more visually with the responsive padding on the global header. And if we open up our dev tools, open responsive design mode, and bring this out further above that breakpoint, you can see that even at this higher breakpoint, everything's starting to line a little cleaner visually. Let's get this refreshed to be our smaller breakpoint size, because now it's probably a good time to finish out the styling of the open state for our global search. Now that we've addressed the responsive layout of the global header as a whole, we can make sure we like the width and layout of the global search form at any breakpoint. So in our app.css, let's go ahead and find our search section. It looks like because we refactored the search button to just be generic button icons, we probably want to rename this section. So let's call this buttons. And let's maybe move this whole block of button icon classes up in our file. So we'll grab this whole chunk, head it out, and let's say it'll follow our skip nav link button. This is more of a generic component that we reuse throughout our UI. Scrolling back down, let's make sure we add a dedicated comment for our search section. And now we can start working on the open state of the search at all breakpoints. So let's go ahead in our index.html file and add the modifier class of search is open. Give that a save. We'll see our search now has a little bit of layout changes that we'll need to overcome because of the recent updates to the global header. So in our CSS, we probably don't need this position relative when it's display none. It actually shouldn't affect anything in the layout, so that seems unnecessary. Get rid of that. And we have it positioned absolutely. We're taking off the left and right margin from the width. I think what we need to do is make sure that it's centered horizontally within the viewport. So we'll say that the position absolute is going to have a left of 50%. And then if we were to do that, you can see that it begins 50% across the viewport. So to tuck it back in, we'll want to say transform, and we're going to translate it on the x-axis, negative 50% of the element's width. So we move it over 50% of the viewport, and then transforms are always relative to the element itself. So negative 50% is referring to half of the element's width. So with that in place, we can see that everything's centered up. We're back to where we started with the mobile first approach for our menu. If we reference our designs now, we're pretty much done with the mobile breakpoint. And as we get larger and larger viewport sizes, we want to basically have the global search form overlap the search open button and the global navigation if we reference our default state here. So let's take a look at our live preview again. And what we'll want to think through is as we open up this viewport, we don't really want to be covering up the entirety of the global header at all breakpoints. What we can do is reference our responsive design implementation for the header itself. If we scroll up a bit here. So we know that we increased the padding around that 1024 pixel breakpoint, so we'll want to take that into account. But more so, it's probably based off of the width of the center nav in our global header. So what we want to see is where this first appears, and also where the padding value between the center nav and the search open button changes. And then what we can do is just manually set, using inspector tools, the width to match so that it overlaps that nicely. So let's find our center nav here. It looks like it first appears above a 786 breakpoint. So with our search form itself, we'll want to make sure that the width declaration is within a media query. So we'll say media, and this will go up to a max width of that 786. Target our search is open modifier class, and we'll bring this width property down. Now anything above this is where we want to actually restrict the width a little further. So let's go ahead and copy this block down. And we know that this is going to be a min width of 787 pixels. And the width we're not quite sure on just yet. We may have to use inspector tools to kind of troubleshoot that a bit. So for now, we'll just get rid of the width property and let it naturally lay out in the document and see what happens here. Okay, so we can kind of see its inherent width in this state. So above 786, let's give this a little bit of an inspection here. Grab the form element, and we can manually set a width just temporarily in here to troubleshoot. So let's say maybe 20 rems or 200 pixels. That's looking like it's not nearly enough. So with our arrow keys and inspector tools, we can just increase this until we find a width that we like. So it looks like somewhere around 44 rems is going to be sufficient for this use case. So we can set that over here, and we'll just keep adjusting these as we look at the various breakpoints and kind of finesse things as we go. All right, so that takes care of this initial breakpoint. Let's make sure that we like what we have so far. Okay, so it looks like this is overwriting right now at all breakpoints, so we want to make sure we address that. And that's just because we have our inspector tools code still live here. So now if we go between the states, that's looking pretty good. What I'm seeing here is, even though we don't show the center nav until 786 and above, this is still looking a little bit wide. We might have enough real estate here to still show the brand and menu icons, even at an in-between breakpoint. So let's adjust this max width for that lowest breakpoint back to 575, and we might want to introduce an intermediary breakpoint here. So at a min width of 576 pixels and a max width of 786 pixels, just to go in between what we had before. Let's adjust the width further here. Again, we'll want to do this in DevTools. Let's make sure that we're actually between those breakpoints. So somewhere in between, let's say the width. Again, we'll start out around 20 rems and just see how much we can get away with here. That still looks good in terms of spacing. So it looks like once we'd get down to 575, this would be changing. It would be going back to full width. So I think we can get away with that. And remember, at 786, that's where it would increase. So I think I actually do like that 28 rems. Let's put that in place, give it a save. Okay, now let's check everything at all breakpoints. Make sure we refresh our DevTools. All right, that's looking good. It's continuing to overlap the contents underneath. Let's go to that widest breakpoint. It looks like around 1200 pixels is where we'll need to increase that a little bit further. So we know we started at 44 rems at the nearest breakpoint. So if we go in here and adjust it further, it looks like 50 rems is kind of our baseline for that largest breakpoint. So our min width, 787, we need to accompany with a max width of 1199 pixels. And then above that max width, so we'll say min width, 1200 pixels, we want to increase the width to 50 rems. So we'll copy this block down, move it into our newest media query, and then adjust this width to be 50 rems. It's looking good. Let's check it again. Refresh. Check it again at all breakpoints. That's looking good. It looks like even the height accounts for the new padding at that largest breakpoint, which is great. Let's make sure, yep, it looks like everything is vertically aligned to the center, which is perfect. So I think that actually takes care of our global search at all breakpoints. Now, as I mentioned in a previous episode, we'll hold off on the actual interactivity of opening and closing the form until later in this series when we finalize things. But now we have a mock-up of all the various states we need for this component. So now we can turn our attention to the global menu that appears on all breakpoints. So similar to what we did with the search, we'll want to make sure we have our modifier class of menu is open. And we'll focus on reviewing the menu when this modifier class is in place. Taking a look at our app.css, our menu should be here at the bottom. So far, what we've done is style the menu trigger and made sure that the menu is display none by default. So let's make sure we get our menu is open class going. And let's just say it'll be display block as a start here. Give that a save. It's looking good. We're seeing all the contents inside now. So you can see that our menu overlays the other content and will remain in a fixed position even if we're scrolling on the page. It also matches the top, right, and bottom edges of the viewport, and we'll address this overlay as well. Let's start with mobile mockups as a good place to begin building this out. So we'll be able to inspect this here. Looking at our live preview, I think the first thing we want to do is get its positioning locked in. So it'll be position fixed. See how that affects things. So it's overlaying our content. We know we want it to have a background color of white, just so we can see what's going on. Okay, so now we can actually see what the dimensions of the element are. Let's make sure that it's always sitting on top of the content beneath it. So we'll give it a z-index of 1. And we want to anchor it again to the top, the right edge, and the bottom edge as well. So it always fills out the available viewport. It looks like that's working as expected. Even if we're to scroll, it's remaining in position, which is great. Let's take a look at what width we want to start out with on mobile. So it looks like we have 288 is what we're starting out with. So we'll want this inside of a media query. Let's say that max width of 575. We want menu is open to have a width of 28.8 rems. Take a look at our live preview here. It's looking good. Let's make sure we're viewing this at the smallest possible breakpoint, just to match what we have here in our design. Now, as we progress through styling this out, we're going to definitely address each of the individual components here. But let's also think through the best way to offer up this overlay that we see. A lot of times this is handled with something like a pseudo element where it's just a visual treatment of everything below it. But a nice pattern is to close a menu, especially an overlay menu like this, whenever somebody clicks outside of the menu itself. So an easy way to accomplish that semantically and also in terms of native functionality is to actually add a button element that'll act as the overlay itself. So let's say that this button, let's say it's the menu overlay. Let's see, span of screen reader only. We want to say that this would close menu. We give that a save. We shouldn't really notice any visual change here, but what we can do is ensure that it always covers the content beneath it. So by default, we want our menu overlay to not be shown. So we'll say that's display none. And we could either toggle its display with a modifier class or rely on this modifier of the menu itself to go to its sibling and change its display type. Just to keep things more encapsulated, let's keep the menu overlay confined to its own modifier class. So we'll say menu overlay is shown, and make sure we add this in our HTML file. So we'll copy that over, tag that on here. All right, so now if we take a look and find that element in our DOM, right now it's not being shown by default. So let's make sure we review it with this modifier class. So we'll say display block. And it's naturally not going to have any height. It probably has some default padding and things. So let's get it sized up as needed. So the first thing is let's clear off any padding that we won't want. And we'll set its width to be 100%. Its height to be 100% as well. Give that a save. It'll also be position fixed, similar to our menu, so it doesn't scroll away. And we're actually going to pin it to all sides of the viewport. So top, right, bottom, and left. Give that a save. You can kind of see it appearing here. If we hovered over, we get some browser default styles. So we'll want to make sure that the background color gets set, and then we'll also want to clear out its border. So the background color is going to be somewhat transparent. So if we take a look at what we did in the actual design files, let's find this overlay. So we have our open state and our overlay. So it's charcoal 21 at 40% opacity. So we can actually set the opacity on the element itself. So we know the background color in this case is going to be that color charcoal 21. The opacity is going to be 0.4. And then we're going to want to get rid of that default border. Okay, so that's looking good. So now if we were to scroll our menu, we'll see that the overlay and the menu itself stay in place, which is great. And what we'll do is, because this button isn't really useful for keyboard navigation users or screen reader users, is we'll actually hide it from the screen reader DOM using aria hidden and set that equal to true. And that way, this is really only for mouse or touch users on different devices, but we don't present other users with unnecessary elements that really don't help them with interactivity. Since we already have the close button in the menu itself, that'll be the main path for keyboard navigation and screen reader users to get out of the menu. So with the overlay taken care of, let's make sure we get that box shadow I noticed on the menu itself put in place. So if we inspect this out a little bit, it looks like we're using one of our charcoal colors at a certain opacity. So we want to get the RGBA value of that. And then we can also see our blur, X and Y positioning on that as well. So for the RGBA, let's click into here and we can take a look at the RGB settings. So we have 40, 51, and 66. Let's make sure we're styling our menu itself when it is open. So this will be a box shadow. And we have an X offset of -0.4 rems. We have no Y offset. We have a blur of 4 rems. And we're not going to have any spread here. Then we're going to bring in RGBA so we can get that transparency going. Looks like we have 40, 51, 66, and then 0.3. We give this a save. It's a pretty subtle change. I think it's more apparent on the desktop sizes where you have more room to kind of see the subtle gradient that appears there. Let's get it back down to our mobile breakpoint. Another thing we might want to consider with the menu itself is if the contents are too tall, because it is position fixed, we want to explicitly allow it to overflow the Y as needed. So we'll set overflow Y to auto. And then that would allow you, if the contents were too tall, to scroll the menu separately from the background contents. All right, so things are coming along. Let's figure out what width we need at the desktop size for the menu itself. Let's close out these menus. Take a look at our desktop mockup one more time. So at this breakpoint, if we open up our header, grab our menu, and see what container size it has, it looks like it'll be 33.4 rems. above that breakpoint. So min width 576. And let's set the menu is open to be 34.4 rems. Cool. So we should have a good draft of the menu component itself. Now it's time to address the contents inside of the menu. And we'll start things off with our close button. We referenced our design. It looks like it'll closely match our other button icon components. So we can add that in our index.html. Let's say class, this will be button icon as a default. And then this will actually be the menu close specific to this block. We know we're going to visually hide some of the contents of the label within this button. So we'll say span, screen reader only. Open that up. This will have close inside of it. And since we don't want the space to be visibly shown, we can add that space within the span. And we actually need a capitalized menu here. Now, if we reference what we did before for other button icons, that specifically the open button, we'll want to match that. So we have tcopy large around menu. We can actually just copy this out and put this on a new line. And lastly, we'll want to bring in our SVG icon that's presentation only. So let's take a look at our files here, go into our assets, our icons. This will be the icon close. So if we give that a copy, drop that in on our button, get our indentation looking good. Let's add role presentation right away. And then this would have a class of button icon. Let's see how close we're getting now. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So we're only showing the label as needed. Looks like we have a little more margin between these elements, so we may have to play with that a little bit. So in addition to being the button icon element, let's say this is the menu close icon. And take a look at our design here for spacing. So if we open up our menu and go into the contents itself, it's the open state. And take a look at the gap between these two elements. So we have 16 pixels. So finding our menu section again, let's say at the menu close button. We'll have some spacing on that in just a minute, but let's focus on the icon inside of it. And we know that we have a margin right of our space default. Cool, that's getting us closer now. Let's check our height on that element. So if we go into our nav, the close button, 40 pixel height. So that's a good tap target size. Now that we have this in place, we can focus on getting its positioning within the menu done. So it looks like our original mockup here only has 18 pixels of height. So we'll have to account for that. But one thing we can do is just dial it in by positioning it so it's vertically aligned with the remaining contents of the header, because we want the close button of the open state of the menu to match what we have for the original trigger element. So we can focus on getting the left padding in. Let's start with mobile first, and then we'll incorporate desktop from there. So it looks like our top padding is going to be a little bit tighter. And then the padding on the left of these elements is going to be that space double. So let's get that implemented. Our menu is open. We know we want a padding left of space double. And this would actually probably make sense to have on both the left and the right. Just so we know we'll never hit that right edge. So let's say space double on both of those. Check it out, it's looking good. So now we know we want to push the menu button down to be vertically aligned with the remaining header contents. So we'll inspect this directly, go to our menu, and we'll want to say the padding top. Let's start out small and then just kind of bump it up from there. So 0.2 rems is too little. 0.8 rems, it's a little too much. Let's see if something in between. Looks like 0.6 rems is what we'll want for that. So we'll have a padding top of 0.6 rems. Looking good. And then the bottom, we don't really have a specific design for that, but let's just say we never want it to be too close to that bottom edge. So we'll match the spacing between these two elements, which is 64 pixels. So I'll say the padding bottom in this case. And we can actually do all these in the shorthand property. So we'll just say padding. The left and right will be the same. So we'll only have to declare that once. And then we'll bring this up and change it to be space quad for the bottom padding. Let's get rid of our sidebar here just for more space. All right, spacing is looking good here. I think our menu button is all taken care of for mobile. Let's take a look at what we need for desktop. So for desktop, the left and right padding is increased to space quad. And for the menu, we'll visually center that as well. So on desktop, we'll take this as a starter, copy that down, move it into our larger breakpoint, and increase the viewport so that we can see how things line up. Okay, so above 576, this is where we want space quad on the left and right. Get that in place. I misspelled that. Let's make sure it's spelled correctly. It's looking good. Vertical alignment should still be good at this point. Let's give it a quick check between those breakpoints. It looks like we might be able to nudge it down a little bit further off the top edge for both these breakpoints. So let's try 0.8 rem just to make sure we like that. It's looking closer. Oh, we still have our 0.6 rem hardcode in here. That's looking a little better, so we'll stick with 0.8 rem for those. And we'll want to find the breakpoint at which we bring in that new vertical height. It looks like that's at the 1024. So at 1024 is where we'll want to increase that padding top a little further. So we may want to tweak our media queries a little bit here, just so we don't override or redeclare ourselves. So we know we want some things to start out at a mobile breakpoint, get cleared at this larger breakpoint, and then some things are shared across multiple media queries. So first off, at a min width of 576, everything holds true except for the padding top, which we know we'll want to update at 1024. So let's get an additional media query in here and say min width of 1025 pixels. Menu is open, grab these. We'll cut out everything we don't need. So the width won't be changing. It looks like just the padding top is something that we'll adjust. We haven't figured out that value yet, so let's dial it in real quick. So our menu, the padding top, start out with like 2 rems. Still not quite there. 3 rems isn't quite there. We might have to go to individual pixels. 3.8, yeah, 3.8 looks good. So the padding top will be updated at a min width of 1025 to be 3.8 rems. So we'll have that in place. One thing I'm noticing though is at a max width of 1024, we'll want the padding top to always hold true. So let's say media max width 1024 pixels and copy this over. Get it moved up into our other media query. The padding top in this case was 0.8 rems. And even though we did use the shorthand before, I think we're actually going to need to be more explicit for each of these still. So we can focus on setting the padding left to space double. Same thing with our padding right. And then get our padding bottom in. And it seems that the padding bottom actually never changes across different breakpoints. So further optimization we can make is to bring the padding bottom into the main block for this modifier class. So we can copy out the padding right and left values, replace what we have for this min width 576 to be quad in this case. Our padding top holds true until the 1024 breakpoint, and then we increase that. Let's make sure we have everything accounted for. So let's make sure we refresh our preview here. Padding top is looking good. We have that smaller padding left until we hit this kind of medium breakpoint. And then once we get large enough, we bring it down to visually align with what we see in the contents of the header. Looks like we could still use a slight bit more padding. These things are kind of just optically centered, so we'll have to tweak that a little bit further. Let's make sure our preview is refreshed. We have 3.8 rems here. I think we might need to go to 4 rems. Yeah, I like that better. So put that in. Okay, everything's looking good in terms of padding across all breakpoints for our menu. We have the overlay of the menu as well as the box shadow in place, and this is a really great start. So here's probably a good place to stop for this episode. So thanks again for watching, and check out the next episode. We'll finish out the contents of the menu and then continue on with the rest of the UI.